Hello, everybody. Can I have your attention? Hello, hello. Start filling the fake auditorium that we have here at the ABA's Virtual Bird Club, Nature Center, Library, wherever you are comfortable uh, watching your bird club meetings. Welcome, everybody. Welcome once again to the ABA's Virtual Bird Club. We're really excited to have you here. We're going to have another great presentation, this time from Robyn Bailey from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's project Nestwatch. She's going to talk birds, and she's going to talk eggs and nests, which is a topic that a lot of people, I'm sure, have on their minds these days. There's a lot of nesting activity going on, even if you are in the middle of the polar vortex that is currently coming down the eastern seaboard, which is not very May weather, but we'll get through it. Before we get started, I do have one announcement to make. I want to say that it's very serendipitous that Robyn is here with us from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, because the ABA and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology have just come together on a deal for Cornell's brand new Birds of the World resource, which is really phenomenal bird resource that's available at birdsoftheworld.com. And you can subscribe, a new subscription to Birds of the World. ABA members can get a new subscription for $15 off. So if you want to join the ABA at aba.org/join, and you want to take advantage of that discount, please let us know. Let us know in the comments if you have used Birds of the World, and we can get to that. You can get the code that you can use in your ABA account at aba.org. But aba.org/join, join the ABA, get 15% off a new subscription to Cornell's fantastic Birds of the World. So without any further ado, I'm going to jump straight into it and welcome to the stream Robyn Bailey from Cornell's Lab of Ornithology, Cornell's Lab of Ornithology, Project Nestwatch. Hello, Robyn. How are you? Hold on, I need to turn your mic on. Now you're good. How are you? Okay, great. I don't think your mic is working. Hold on just a second. It was working and now it's not. Oh no, can people hear her? What is going on here? Yeah, please bear with us. I'm trying to figure this out. It was working earlier and now it's not working. No, it's... Yeah, no, we're getting... please bear with us, folks. I'm going to go back to the intro and I'm going to figure this out. It was working before. Please hold on. We're going to get this straightened out. Bear with us just a second.
People. We're good? Good.
We're good. Hello, we're back. And we've got this figured out. It was a Skype setting. I'm going to blame Skype. It's been a touchy partner for this whole virtual bird club thing. But we are back now. Robyn Bailey, welcome. Thank you for joining us. How has your quarantine been going? So far, so good?
It's been going so far, so good. Just this week, we had hummingbird and oriole show up. So that was the highlight of this week, is that they finally came.
That's
it's been
great.
pretty cold.
Yeah, I live down here in the
Yeah,
southeast, and we our hummingbirds have been here for a while, but I have not seen orioles. That's you're up in Ithaca, correct? At the Cornell.
correct. That's a good unit.
Yeah, you guys get many more orioles than we do down here. That must be very exciting. I know that we on our What's This Bird page, people have been posting photos of orioles like crazy, so it must be great. So, what are you going to talk to? What are you going to talk about tonight?
I am going to talk about nests and eggs. We're going to look at nesting birds from nest building all the way through fledging. I
Okay,
hope that
great.
you can see. Uh,
Yeah, and one of the things that we do want to warn everybody, we are definitely going to get kind of up in birds' business while we're doing this. So be prepared. If you're a bird, this might be a little uncomfortable. If you're a human, it's less so. But please be aware
yeah.
that we're going to leave nothing out when we talk about nests and eggs. So, without further ado, Robyn, I am going to throw this over to you and your PowerPoint presentation. Please just let me know when you need the slides moved. This is one of the weird technical things that we have had to deal with here with this virtual bird club. We're all kind of getting through it. But yeah, just let me know when you need them moved. Everything should be ready to go. And without further ado, welcome, Robyn Bailey. Clap, clap, clap. This is the part in the bird club where everybody claps.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm going to assume everyone's had a chance to read the title so we can take a look at the outline. Um, so if you're looking at the outline, I just want to just briefly share what we'll talk about in this lecture, what you can expect to learn about today. I'll start by talking about the 8 stages of the breeding cycle. We'll cover some common nest building styles for birds common in North America. We'll touch on brood parasitism and what that means. I'll go over some common nesting bird ID tips, and we'll finish with a look at how you can help nesting birds from home. So just jumping right in, let's start talking about the nesting cycle. There are 8 stages to the nesting cycle. Finding a place to breed, choosing a mate, nest building, copulation, egg formation, incubation, hatching, feeding the young, and leaving the nest. And when it's listed all out for you, like it is on this slide, it sounds as though it's a very linear process and that it happens one thing after the next. But the reality is that not every bird will do every step, and they may be doing more than one thing at a time. So they may be copulating and adding to the nest, or they may be, feeding young and also doing something else. So even though it looks like a very linear process, it can be very different, and birds like to mix it up. So just keep that in mind as we go through. So let's start with the first stage of the breeding cycle, finding a place to breed. It might help to start by backing up and saying, why do birds start nesting when they do? Why is there a breeding season? And throughout the year, birds are using day length to tell what season it is. So when the number of hours of daylight exceeds a certain critical level, physiological changes are triggered in birds, which prepare them to breed. Being in a temperate region, most of our birds also are going to time their breeding activities so that they will be feeding their nestlings when the most food is most abundant. So well before that happens, they need to select a breeding territory. Now, a non-migratory species might either maintain a territory throughout the winter or establish a new one as they arrive in the spring. Good territories are going to provide potential nest sites, reliable food sources to feed those young, and protection from predators. So that's why when you look at these northern flickers on the screen, they're fighting over territory and they look like they mean business because there's a lot at stake. So finding that place to breed is pretty important. Now we'll move on and talk about how to choose a mate. While birds' territories are being claimed, birds are also trying to attract a mate. And in most species, it's the female who chooses the male based on an assessment of their overall quality and vigor. Now, males are going to advertise how suitable they are by various means. They could be exhibiting bright breeding plumage during courtship displays. They might bring food to the females, which always works for me. I like that. They could demonstrate their nest building abilities or advertise singing, drumming, or calling. So there's lots of different things that can go into the mate selection process. So social bonds are gonna tie those males and females together, at least throughout that breeding season. But it's important to know that promiscuity is not uncommon. DNA analyses have shown that even birds that presumably mate for life, such as bluebirds, may not always be faithful. So it is possible for nestlings in a single nest to be fathered by different males. Males of some species, in fact, such as the red-winged blackbird and house wren, can have more than one mate at a time. So that's a system called polygyny. And that's going to be, one male having multiple females. So there's a little animation there. You can press to pop up the two vocabulary words, and the next vocabulary word is polyandry, and that's the opposite of polygyny. And it's much less common. In that system, females, such as the Wilson's phalarope, for example, they may have more than one male mate. That's less common than polygyny. So there's these different breeding systems, but for the most part, what we see as typical is the serial monogamy, we would call it, meaning together for a breeding season, if that makes sense. Okay, so the next step then is nest building. And again, this is all kind of happening at the same time. So as the territories are being claimed, birds are attracting mates, they're also going to be trying to create a nest or somewhere for the young and eggs to develop. So birds' nests can be extremely diverse. And even though they really vary in what they do, each species typically has a characteristic nest style, almost like a blueprint. Some will be very elaborate, others will be very simple. Some can be little more than a depression in the ground. Many birds construct their nests from natural materials like grass, leaves, mud, lichens, and fur, or some prefer man-made materials like paper, plastic, or yarn. The key thing is that nests can be found almost anywhere, on the ground, in trees, in burrows, on the sides of cliffs, in and on our man-made structures, and we're going to look at some of that variety today. Females typically build nests, but sometimes both parents will build, or just the male might build it. In this photo, hopefully you're looking at some tree swallows that are fighting over an egret feather, which they all want for their nest. And you might think that that's kind of just a nice fluffy thing, and maybe it's kind of random, but it's really not. Research has shown that the more feathers in a tree swallow nest, the higher the growth rates of the chicks. So it's cool to think about every nest material has been selected deliberately for a specific reason. They are not random in their selection of nest materials. So I think that's kind of cool, yeah. Okay, here's where it's gonna get a little bit awkward in the upcoming 2 slides. Shield your eyes, look away if you need to, but we are moving into the copulation and egg formation section of the talk. So during the breeding season, birds are going to undergo some hormonal changes that will cause their, for males, the internal testes will swell more than 1,000 times to obtain a functional size. So yeah, it's not something you can see physically from the outside of the bird. It's more of a coming out of an atrophied state. So that will happen with the ovaries as well. But ovaries and oviduct of the females will also increase in size in preparation for egg fertilization and development. So, so this is what it looks like, obviously. And in the next slide, we're gonna talk about structure, and we're gonna talk about the cloaca. So during copulation, the male is going to bring his cloaca into contact with that of the female. They both have one called a cloaca for both, and hopefully transfer sperm. If the sperm travel to the oviduct, hopefully, if everything goes well, they'll penetrate through the wall of the ovum or egg, and fertilization takes place. Ovulation and laying take about 24 hours, so female birds typically produce at most 1 egg per day. Hopefully it's clear, but I have labeled the cloaca should you need to have some assistance in finding it. Should be pretty clear. Sometimes you can actually see this in the field, especially during the breeding season. if the wind blows the right way, you might be able to see that. So this is a reproductive and digestive opening. So this is a cool structure. Okay, so move on to a less awkward topic. Now you should be looking at a diagram of the ovaries. So don't worry about learning or memorizing all of these structures. I just think it's really cool to show you the journey that the egg will take. So you don't need to worry about this, but it's super cool, I think, to see how things happen. So what's going to happen is that mature egg, as it's released from the ovary, it'll be fertilized near the top of the oviduct. It'll travel down that oviduct where it receives a layer of albumin. That's the egg white. And as it travels further down the oviduct, it acquires more albumin, a shell, and finally pigments are added as it nears the cloaca. As I said, most small songbirds will produce about 1 egg per day. For raptors, herons, and other birds of prey, the pattern is usually 1 egg every other day or so. And this diagram is a little bit stretched out, so you can see everything. In reality, it would be much more compact and tightly joined. So it's just an illustration. But don't worry too much about that. Let's move on and talk about pigments, because I did mention that they were added last. And pigments are really cool because birds are the only species that add pigment to their eggs. And so I think that's worth talking about for just a second. And it can be really variable among species. Even actually within an individual bird could have a very highly varied clutch. So these are all eggs of different common mirrors. Just as an example, this is a cliff nesting seabird that nests in dense colonies. Not all birds are as variable as this in their egg coloration. So it's cool to think about why common mirrors might need to have this level of variation. Some scientists will speculate that it's to help them tell their own eggs from those of others. And when they're in a really dense nesting colony, it could be important for egg recognition. But there is no one answer that's true for every species. So there's a lot of scientific debate about the functions of pigments in birds' eggs. And it seems like many species are using them differently. For example, camouflage or egg recognition. Sometimes when eggs are really brightly colored, like blue eggs, it can signal health. Others speculate that pigment may have some UV protection. And then other birds have no pigment whatsoever on their eggs, so they're not using it. So it's just an interesting thing about birds that is both beautiful and scientifically intriguing. So coming up next, we're going to talk about incubation. And as you probably know, birds need to incubate their eggs to keep them at the proper temperature and ensure normal development. Female songbirds usually begin incubation after they have finished laying all of their eggs, so that they will hatch at approximately the same time. That's called synchronous hatching. Other birds such as herons, cranes, cormorants, and raptors will begin incubation as soon as the first egg is laid. And their eggs are going to hatch on different days, so you can get that older sibling, younger sibling effect. And when you see that, it's called asynchronous hatching. In some species, like mourning doves, both the male and the female will incubate. Incubation time varies depending on the species, but typically the larger the bird, the longer it needs to incubate. Usually females, but also sometimes males, will develop this structure called a brood patch. If you want to show that, the brood patch is this really weird looking patch on the belly where the feathers have molted off and the belly becomes very vascularized, meaning blood flow is increased to that area. And this allows for skin to egg contact and better heat conduction. Now, not all species will develop a brood patch, and this is pretty difficult to see in the field. If you'll notice in the photo, the person is holding a bird in the hand, and they're physically blowing on the feathers on that belly to part the feathers so that they can determine whether this bird is in the breeding condition. So that's how we're able to see that brood patch. But normally you don't really see a brood patch in the wild. But it's just a cool little structure. It's kind of interesting to look at it so close. I like that. Okay. So let's talk about what's happening inside the egg while this incubation process is happening. What's going on inside? Well, on the left, you should see an image that would look pretty familiar to people if you've ever cooked with eggs. That's kind of what it looks like when they're first laid. And then as you move on, as the egg is developing, the embryo is going to consume that yolk. So the yolk is getting smaller and smaller. On the next slide, you'll see that by day 12, the yolk is noticeably smaller and the embryo has differentiated a little bit more. And by day 14, which is getting near the hatch date for many small birds, the yolk is almost exhausted and it's time to hatch. So from the time the egg was laid until the time it is ready to hatch, an egg typically loses about 18% of its initial weight due to moisture loss. So if you were wondering, and I'm sure you were, if eggs are heavier or lighter at the end of the incubation period, they are lighter, which I just think is so cool. So yeah, let's move on down the process and talk about hatching. Hatching is a super labor-intensive process. It's physically demanding. So the head needs to be positioned near the blunt end of the egg, which is thinner and easier to break. A temporary structure called the egg tooth must be brought into contact with the shell and used to perforate the eggshell. This is called pipping. And it's accomplished by rapidly opening and closing the mouth. Hopefully you can see that egg tooth. It's a little bit faint in the image, but you'll see it again later. But once that shell is pipped, the chick can then use its wings to help force the eggshell open. So this can take several hours for the hatching to occur. Okay, so on the next slide, birds exhibit a range of maturity levels at hatching. So you can see them here arrayed from least developed on the left to most developed on the right as they hatch. This is how they would come out of the egg. Altricial birds on the left are most songbirds, which means that they hatch naked with their eyes closed. They're pretty helpless. They require brooding for the first few days to keep them warm. Birds that are semi-altricial, like most birds of prey, they're going to hatch with some down, and they're generally going to have their eyes open at hatching. But they still need to remain in the nest quite a long time, and they're going to depend on their parents for food as well. Moving down, we've got semi-precocial species like gulls and terns, which are even more mature when they hatch, but they're still going to remain in the nest for 2 or more days and rely on the parents to bring food. Semi-precocial birds will be capable of walking and swimming if they want to. And then finally, we have precocial young, and these are the most independent at hatching. They can pretty much walk away from the nest immediately. They're going to vary in the extent to which they depend on their parents for food, but they are capable of following the parents and finding their own food or being shown food that they then pick up. So that's what you're seeing there is that generally the longer the bird is in the egg, the more likely it is to be precocial. So those precocial chicks take a little bit more time in the incubation period. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do once those chicks have hatched out is they're going to be having constant food demands that are having to be met. So to keep up with those demands, the parents must continuously forage for food. You may have noticed that the young of most birds have really brightly colored mouths. Perhaps you've seen that. This is called the gape, and gape color is one way to actually help identify the nestlings of different species. Brightly colored gapes also serve as a sort of target that helps guide the parents. It's like a neon sign that says, put food in here. And in fact, studies have shown that some species gapes are visible in the ultraviolet spectrum. So birds can see them and can see in some species patterns that we really cannot see. So there's some information there that's being conveyed in the gape, even though it's hard for us to see. Typically, the hungrier a nestling is, the more it will gape and beg for food. So that helps the parents distribute the food appropriately. Now, this is a really dangerous time for both the adults and the young because the increased activity and begging cries of the nestlings are potentially attracting predators. So as you can see from these 2 tree swallows, these nestlings are not exactly discreet. They are hanging out of the entrance and begging loudly. So if you've ever been walking through the woods and heard this sound, you might have noticed, like, gosh, it seems like a predator could find them really easily. So it's to their advantage to get out of the nest as quickly as they possibly can. Okay, so moving on, the next slide is kind of fun. Again, a little bit awkward. But, I include this slide despite its awkwardness because it's something I get asked about a lot. Folks will see a bird carrying this little white packet and want to know what it is, or why is the bird carrying this egg away, or why is it taking food away from the babies? And it's actually a fecal sac. So many small songbirds have this ingenious solution to waste disposal. Almost as soon as the young are finished with a feeding, they will turn themselves upside down and present this fecal sac to the adult. The adult will then grasp it and carry it away from the nest so that the accumulation of feces doesn't create an unsanitary condition or draw the attention of predators if it was to accumulate underneath the nest. So occasionally the parents will swallow it, which is thought to maybe be done to reclaim some of the lost nutrition because the baby's digestion is not very efficient. However, it's also possible that it could just be carrying it away and it just looks like they're swallowing it. So sometimes they do this, but not always. So how come babies are able to produce this fecal sac immediately after being fed? It is immediate. It happens as soon as they swallow the food. Well, if you think about it, it's more efficient if the parents can take care of two jobs in one trip. So if they can arrive with food and leave with waste, then they save themselves a trip having to do that later. So it's actually pretty clever. And not all birds have this process, but most of our small songbirds will do this. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about leaving the nest. Most birds are only going to nest once per year, but some species like American robins and Carolina wrens, they can nest up to 4 or 5 times during a single breeding season. After leaving the nest, a process that we call fledging, young birds will typically remain close to their parents for a short period. But during this time, young birds are really vulnerable. They have to learn to survive on their own, and they can be vulnerable to predators or starvation. Unfortunately, the first year is the toughest, and in nearly all species, more than half of the first-year birds will perish. For birds that do make it, though, the odds of surviving improve dramatically. You can tell a fledgling in the field by its downy tufts, which may not have molted yet. Those bright gape flanges will still be obvious, but these go away after the bird reaches maturity. You'll also notice short primaries and a short tail are also a giveaway. And fledgling identification can be kind of tricky. We get a lot of emails and questions in July and August for people asking for help identifying a mystery bird. And it's for these very reasons that they haven't grown the field marks, or the tail, or the eye color might be different. So fledgling ID can be a little bit tricky. But keep in mind the markers that you would be looking for to first know you're looking at a fledgling. And if you know you're looking at a fledgling, that will help a lot in figuring out what birds you're actually seeing. Okay. So we've talked about that. Once they've left the nest, how long before Independence Day, you might wonder? A lot of people actually are curious about how long birds associate with their parents. Maybe a lot of people are wondering that now that their kids are home all day, every day. And generally speaking, the larger the bird, the longer it will be dependent on its parents for food and instruction. So for example, smaller birds like the American robin and blue jay that we see here, they'll stick around for probably 3 or 4 months in their parents' territory. And that gives them a little bit of protection by hanging out close to mom and dad. For larger birds like this Canada goose and sandhill crane, the young will associate with their parents throughout most of the first year. So it can vary from just a couple of weeks to an entire year. So we have different parenting styles across the board. Okay, now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some different architectural styles. I want to show you 8 different common types of nests that can be found in North America. Just know that this list is meant to highlight a diversity of birds' nests, but it's not an exhaustive list of worldwide nest types. These are the ones you're most likely to see. First, we can just mention briefly, since we're looking at these cliff swallows, that nests can be placed in colonies or individually. So, different situations. We've got males, females, or both participating in construction, depending on the species. And each species is following that kind of architect's blueprint, like I mentioned before, and that they tend to only make one kind of nest. So keep that in mind as we look at our first nest type, which is the scrape nest. The scrape nest is a shallow depression in the ground, typically shaped by the bird's feet and breast. They are commonly built in gravel, sand, leaf litter, and generally they will be camouflaged to look like the substrate. These nests are made by many shorebirds, gulls, terns, nighthawks, and similar species. Now, this nest is a killdeer's nest, which is a common nesting bird in North America, and maybe one of the easier scrape nests to find. But generally, scrape nests are very difficult to find. So it's kind of a treasure if you can find a scrape nest, because there's just almost no material there to find, and the eggs are usually very camouflaged. So if you can find a scrape nest, you're doing a good job. Okay, this next one is probably the nest you think of when you imagine a bird's nest. It's the cup nest. And it's perhaps the most common type of nest built by small songbirds. They can be supported from the rim, like this warbling vireo's suspended cup nest. That's very characteristic of vireos, to suspend their nest from the top rim. They can be supported from below, like a hummingbird nest, or they can be adherent, meaning they are glued onto a surface or even a vertical wall using mud or saliva. There's some flickering lights going on in this room. Sorry about that. So that the adherent nest is going to be adhered to a wall, similar to, think of a barn swallow or a chimney swift nest. That's an adherent cup nest. So everything from warblers to vireos, gnatcatchers, hummingbirds, and many, many other species are going to build a cup nest out of a wide variety of materials. The next one is my favorite. It's the cavity nest. This is another common type of nest. Birds can either excavate their own cavity, like these pileated woodpeckers, or they can come in and use cavities created by other species. And if that's the case, then you're called a secondary cavity nester. And birds like tree swallows and bluebirds will exhibit that kind of dependency on other excavators. So on the one hand, cavity nests are very safe, and it's a great way to protect your nest from the elements, maintain humidity, great protection from predators. You have a better chance of surviving if you're raised in a cavity nest. But on the other hand, you have to be in a place where either a woodpecker has created a cavity for you, or you have to be a woodpecker and excavate your own cavity. And even if you are a woodpecker, you still rely on the presence of a suitable dead tree. So, for example, in Australia, there are not any native excavators. So the birds there, the cavity nesters there, have to rely on processes like rot or lightning strike or something like that to create a cavity. But here in North America, we have more than 80 different species that are known to nest in cavities. And it's for those reasons that I mentioned, those limitations, that many people will put up a nest box to help support those native cavity nesting birds, particularly the secondary cavity nesting birds. And we'll talk a little bit about nest boxes in a few minutes. But let's talk about now the next type of nest, which is the pendant nest. Here's that beautiful oriole that I was so excited to see earlier this week. And they make this beautiful pendant nest that looks like a woven pouch-like structure. Some people describe it as a sock hanging in a tree, which is a little difficult to see from the angle of the photo, but it does kind of resemble a sock or a bag hanging in a tree. This male oriole is peeking into the nest at the young. They like to use really long fibers like dry grasses, but you can see that this builder also included some man-made materials, which is pretty common for orioles. Other species that do this are bush tits. If you're on the West Coast, you might have bush tits, and they make a nest that is even longer than this and a little shaggier. So orioles, bush tits, and even a number of tropical species make this kind of nest. Next up, we have the platform. The platform nest is usually made of rigid twigs with a shallow bowl lined with softer materials. They can be super simple, like the nest of a mourning dove, or they can be very complex, like nests of bald eagles, ospreys, or great blue herons. Platform nests are also really popular with species that don't make their own nest and prefer to use the old nests of others. So one example is great horned owls. They can often be seen using a stolen or repurposed platform nest, although they do use cavities as well. But because they tend to last a long time, they can be repurposed by other species. Okay, next up we have the spherical or dome nest. This is a little bit less common. The ovenbird nest is what we're looking at here. It builds a domed nest on the ground with this side entrance, and it's nearly impossible to spot from above, really well camouflaged. Another species that does this is the Carolina wren. Their scientific name means cave dweller, and their nest does in fact look like a little cave with a side entrance. They're often quite domed. Out west, you have verdin make a dome type nest. So a few species will do this. So they're just really neat. I don't have too much more to say about that. So let's move on and talk about burrows. Burrows are excavated in sandy soils or in cliffs. Obviously, we have the burrowing owl here, but other species do this too. The belted kingfisher, bank swallow, and northern ruffed-winged swallow will build a horizontal burrow in a cliffside or riverbank. Birds like the Atlantic puffin, razorbills, and obviously this burrowing owl will use or find an underground burrow. Now, these burrowing owls happen to be nesting in an artificial burrow that was created for them by placing pipes underground, probably as part of a relocation project, but they are capable of digging their own burrow. But hey, if somebody's going to make you a free burrow, why spend the energy? Okay, and the last one I want to talk about is the floating vegetation nest, or the raft. These redneck grebes have built a nest of floating vegetation like most grebes do. And this is a kind of a mound nest. A few aquatic species do this. Your pied-billed grebes, black tern, American coot, purple gallinule. You can also find these mounded nests closer to land, maybe even on land, so they're not necessarily have to be floating. But they're another cool nest that, if done properly, hopefully would avoid being flooded. The idea is not to be flooded here. Okay, so we've seen a variety of nest types, from floating aquatic nests to underground burrows to woven pouches high in the canopy. But there's one more nesting situation that we haven't talked about yet, and I alluded to it earlier. And that is, remember when I said that not every species does every stage of the nesting cycle. Some birds don't make a nest, some don't incubate, and some don't raise their young. So if you're looking at the image that's asking, do all birds make a nest? You probably know the answer by now, that no, not all birds make a nest. So the situation here is we're looking at a brown-headed cowbird that has parasitized this American robin nest. And cowbirds are a special type of bird called a brood parasite. They do not make a nest of their own, but they do lay their eggs in the nests of other birds. And they will use a wide variety of host species to lay their eggs. In fact, I have a brown-headed cowbird that's been hanging around my Phoebe nest on my back porch every day this week and checking it out, just waiting. And that situation is called interspecific brood parasitism because it happens between species. You might be surprised to know that intraspecific brood parasitism also happens when birds lay the eggs in the nests of species of their own kind, in addition to having their nest. So not all brood parasitism is obligatory. For the cowbird, it is obligatory. They have no choice but to lay their egg somewhere else for someone else to raise. But we do see species like the wood duck and other cavity nesting ducks, and even wild turkey have been documented leaving their eggs in the nests of other birds. Usually this is more of an opportunistic thing that may just allow them to get a leg up in case their own nest is destroyed. They still have some genes out there, but they don't depend on it like the cowbird does. So there's these two kind of ways that this can happen. And I would be remiss not to mention that there are some birds that don't make a nest, but they're not brood parasites. So for example, white terns in Hawaii, emperor penguins, these are species that have special adaptations that allow them to care for their young without the hassle of making a nest. So that's brood parasitism. I'm just going to be conscious of time. I see it's 8:40. So I want to go through just a couple of these common nests. And I do apologize, most of them are sort of Eastern species focused, but you can think of them as representative of their kind. So there will be West Coast analogs as well. And I'll just show them to you. I'll go through them fairly quickly because when you're identifying a nest, it's more important to make note of the characteristics that are important so you can look them up later. Many nests and eggs look alike, and it's very hard to commit them all to memory. So let's just think of this exercise as a way to kind of figure out what's important and what's maybe less important. So, these mourning doves, as is true for doves and pigeons, are going to lay 2 white eggs, always 2. Here's a species that doesn't use any pigment, and they make a flimsy kind of platform nest. So they're in this nesting basket because anytime they have that foundation underneath them, that will help them out because their nests are usually very thin and not very sturdy. So pigeons and doves will lay those 2 white eggs, and they are both the male and the female are going to incubate and care for the young. So mourning doves make pretty good parents. And this is also a species that doesn't do the fecal sac. So their waste does accumulate around the nest, which is probably why many people think of pigeons as being dirty, because they're not having that waste removal mechanism that other species do have. So that's your pigeons and doves. Let's talk about barn swallows. This is a bird that uses its beak to collect mud pellets, and mixes it with grass, and then sticks it onto the side of a building or under a bridge, in barn rafters, other sheltered places. Historically, they would have nested in caves throughout North America, but now they're pretty much nesting exclusively on human-made structures. So they also do reuse nests from one year to the next. So if you have a barn swallow nest on your home, feel free to leave it there. They might repurpose it and use it next year, just adding in some new feathers and renovating it a little bit. They'll lay 3 to 7 eggs, and that can vary. And the eggs are incubated by the female alone. One cool thing to know about barn swallows is that they do tend to have a higher level of extra pair paternity, meaning other males will sire eggs other than the ones in their own nest. So there's a little bit of promiscuity going on there. Okay, let's take a quick look at blue jay and jays with their bulky nests. Usually they have an outer layer of twigs, an inner bowl of bark, leaves, moss, lichens, and grasses. Only the female jay will incubate, but the male is responsible for bringing all of the food to the female during incubation. The clutches range from 3 to 5 eggs. The males help feed the young, and they're really good providers. And blue jays do have long-term pair bonds and are said to mate for life. Next up, the American robin. This should be a nest that's familiar to most people, but I want you to notice you can really see in this photo the mud. Mud is an essential component to a thrush nest. So if you see mud, that's a good indication that you're looking at a thrush nest, provided it's this rough size of a robin's nest. These are common nesting birds. They do have that typical classic robin's egg blue. Because it uses mud, robin nests are heavy, so you can look for them on sturdy substrates like your home. I have 2 nesting on my garage right now. But if not on your home, then on a sturdy evergreen or deciduous tree branch, probably low to the ground, and an evergreen or higher in a deciduous tree where they're looking for that stability. And the situation with the robin is that the females will incubate, but both sexes will care for the young. And it takes them about 12 to 14 days to fledge. So I'm looking at about a month of not being able to park in my garage because the robins get disturbed every time I go out there. So look around, you probably have a robin nest somewhere near your home. Next up, we have the hummingbird, and I include this not because it's easy to find, but because it's easily mistaken for other species, or rather other species are mistaken for hummingbird nests. And I think that happens because it's just very difficult to imagine how small a hummingbird nest is. So we will often get photos of warbler nests or gnatcatcher or vireo nests, and folks will ask if they're a hummingbird nest. And it's like, no, take it even smaller than that. The hummingbird nest is teeny tiny. The eggs are about the size of a Tic Tac. Now this is a different mating system. This is a polygynous mating system where the males do not contribute anything other than securing the territory and the sperm, basically. They move on and the female does all of the nest building, incubation, feeding the young. So the males don't help in that way. The hummingbirds, interestingly, like the mourning dove, always lay 2 white eggs. Always 2, always white. So that's pretty cool. And they like to use a lot of spider webs to anchor their lichen-covered nest to a small twig. Very hard to find. And hummingbirds, I know I said that usually the larger the bird, the longer it needs to stay in the nest, but hummingbirds are kind of an exception, right? They're so exceptionally tiny that these have a disproportionately long nestling period. So they need about 18 to 22 days to fledge. So that's long relative to their body size. Okay, just quickly show you, this is an eastern bluebird, but western and mountain bluebird look very much the same. Beautiful blue eggs because they are in that thrush family. You could put up a birdhouse to attract them. The nest hole is really important in their mating system and their courtship displays. And they can lay anywhere from 3 to 6 eggs and have 2 to 3 nests a year. So if you think you would get a lot of enjoyment and you live in the right habitat, you can put up a bluebird box and monitor your bluebirds. Okay, the last one I want to show you is a chickadee. This is a black-capped chickadee nest, but it's typical of most chickadees. They're another cavity nesting bird. And I like to show this one because it's a great example of a nest that is really cozy. It's very easy to identify. This combination of moss and fur is very typical of chickadees, and it's pretty distinctive. They can lay anywhere from 6 to 8 eggs, although I did find one this year that had 9 eggs in it, which is a lot of eggs. They're about the size of a jelly bean. The females have a cute habit of covering the eggs with nest material when she leaves the nest to keep them warm and maybe also to hide them from predators. And the young can leave the nest after about 16 days. And the funny thing about chickadee nestings is that they look exactly like the adults. So that inset photo is the baby chickadees. They are not hard to identify. They look exactly like the adult chickadees, which is really cute. Okay, so I want to quickly move on and talk about how to help nesting birds, and then we hopefully have some time for questions. So how to help, action item number 1, as I mentioned, you can put up a nest box, and I'll draw your attention to that URL, that nestwatch.org/birdhouses is our website that has individual species nest box plans that you can download for free, and you can use the tool to choose which species will be attracted to your region and your habitat. And then it will also have tips that are attractive for that specific species, whether it's a kestrel or a violet green swallow, like the birds in the photo. So it has everything you need to troubleshoot any problems, attract the specific bird you're looking for, and any other questions you might have if you're looking to put up a nest box. Okay, next slide, we have the reminder that if you do put up a nest box, a good thing to do is to put a predator guard on that nest box. And that website also has instructions for how to make different kinds of predator guards, because you want to protect that nest. Even if you do keep your cat indoors, other people don't. And there are other predators in the environment like raccoons, squirrels, chipmunks, and mice that would happily use your nest box as a feeding station. So it's a good idea to put it on a freestanding pole and put a predator guard on it. In fact, our research that we've done through Nestwatch data has demonstrated that predator guards can increase the nesting success of your birdhouse birds. So check out the website, get the plans for how to make a nest box and a predator guard. Next up, a quick reminder about pruning and mowing. So we want to prune trees and shrubs when birds are not nesting. So essentially, like the fall is a great time to do it, but March through August is a little bit risky. A nest that is exposed from pruning has a very low chance of surviving. So if you do have to prune, just be very cautious and look for nests ahead of time before you just launch into that project. Another thing is you don't want to let your grass grow long enough to attract birds to nest in it and then mow it. So think about those ground nesting birds. You can either let your grass grow wild and let them nest in it, or you can mow it so frequently that it is manicured and it doesn't attract ground nesting birds in the first place and then put them at risk from the mower. So ideally, one of those two situations, but the worst thing to do would be to let the grass grow, attract nesting birds, and then after a month, mow it. That would not be a good situation. And I hope that, if you do those things, also think about minimizing insecticides because birds do forage on the ground and they do use insects to feed their young. So think about that too. Wrapping it up, I would definitely like to point out that Nestwatch is our citizen science project. That's the one that I administer at the Lab of O. And it asks anyone who finds a nest to report your observations to us. Simply log in and create a nest location. Tell us the species, how many eggs, how many chicks, and any other important details that you see. And you can learn more about how to join at nestwatch.org. It's free. There's a free mobile app, and you can use an existing Lab of Ornithology login. If you already participate in eBird or FeederWatch, you would already have access to Nestwatch as well. Otherwise, you can just create an account and start reporting your nests. Now, the Cornell Lab has been collecting data on nesting birds from the public for more than 50 years, and we have some really incredible research results that have come out of it during that time, including that predator guard study that I just mentioned. So if you want to join thousands of other people in contributing to studies of nesting birds, take a look at Nestwatch. And on the last slide, I'll just especially emphasize that while we're all staying at home right now, people have been asking if there's any value in submitting the common everyday birds like robins and finches, sparrows and pigeons that they see every day. They think that maybe that's boring. But the answer that I would say is yes, these are in fact what make really valuable data because scientists can analyze data from those common species throughout their entire breeding range. I would argue that these are probably more important than those rare elusive species as they help us track the reasons behind the declines in our common breeding birds. You can also participate from anywhere in the world, not just North America. So we're open, we're working from home, but we're here to help answer your questions and support you if you decide to participate in Nestwatch. So with that, I'll turn it over to Nate, see if we've got enough time for any questions, and I would love to take those questions.
Well done, Robyn. Clap, 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 clap. To what an informative talk. I know a lot of people who are following along enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Take a drink of water. I'm sure your mouth is dry. You've been talking for the better part of an hour. But we do have some questions.
That was a lot.
Yeah, it is. We do have some questions, and I'm going to throw them at you. Let's see. I'm going to scroll on back. Laura asked a question, where and how do birds get the pigment for their eggs?
Oh, that's a really good question. Birds obtain the pigment through diet, and some of it they can produce. So they'll produce this with special cells that line the oviduct, and they're like little, it's hard to describe, but almost like a printer where they release the pigments onto the egg, and it can be done in layers. So as the egg rotates and turns, that's how you get that speckling. And you can see like multi-dimensional pigment deposition as well sometimes too. So yeah, so they're getting it mostly from their diet.
That's really interesting. And when you're talking about platform nests and how sometimes great horned owls steal the platform nest from other birds. You reminded me of a story of an encounter that happened here in North Carolina where some osprey were trying to build on a platform, and then so they were getting pretty far along in their nest building, and then I guess overnight some great horned owls came and like completely evicted the osprey from the nest, and they actually killed one of the parent osprey because great horned owls are like bruisers, like they're tough birds, and I guess the dead osprey was like hanging from the platform.
Oh, God.
As like obviously as a warning to any other osprey that would try and take it over. But anyway,
An
sometimes
effigy.
those yeah, exactly. Sometimes the nest evictions can be pretty rough.
Yeah, it's a
Another
serious business.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Another question people ask, someone asked about your pronunciation of the word yolk. What is the correct way to pronounce that? Is there a proper scientific way to pronounce that word, or is that just a personal thing?
I say yolk. I grew up in Alabama, so I have a southern
Oh,
accent.
yeah, it only shows up on one word.
So I might have said yolk.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just checking, like maybe it's a Parula Parla thing. Like there's different ways to pronounce it. I don't know. Maybe there is a
Yeah,
right way to do it.
I try to say yolk, but sometimes my southern accent gets the better of me.
There you go. There's your question.
It's
There's your
funny.
answer. Yeah, of course, if anyone has any additional questions about Robyn's talk, please let us know in the comments. I will try to get to them as much as possible. We have a couple more that I did want to get to before we say goodnight because it is almost 9 o'clock. Jane Keegan has a question about why would a near to fledging chickadee die? Like, why would they die perhaps in the nest is how I interpret that. Before they're able to fledge, and I guess unsaid in that comment, but I'm interpreting it is that maybe the rest of the chicks fledged, but one didn't make it. Why would that happen?
Okay. Yeah, so I monitor nest boxes, and it's not uncommon to find one young that didn't make it out of the box at the end of the nesting season.
Mm-hmm.
So I see that with a chickadee or a tree swallow, a house wren. It's
Mm-hmm.
just occasionally one of them will not make it. And there could be a couple of different things going on. If it was a particularly large brood and a difficult season,
Mm-hmm.
for example, if there wasn't enough food,
Right.
there might not have been enough food to feed all of the young. Sometimes one of them might just have a difficulty. It might hatch with a difficulty, so it's not vigorous. It may
Mm-hmm.
not beg enough to get the food that it needs to grow as quickly as the others. Occasionally, and this is less common, but entanglement could be an issue if sometimes a foot can become entangled in nest material, and that is usually, if that's the case, there are plastics in the nest, which are easily entangled. So that occasionally a horsehair or something in the nest might do that. So there are a couple of things, but if I don't see any real evidence of anything, I usually tend to think that it was a lack of food.
And should someone that's watching that nest, should they remove the entire nest after the birds have fledged? Would the birds come back and use that box again, that cavity again?
Yeah, it depends on the species, but so for example, tree swallows up here are only going to nest once a year, and you can just go ahead and clean it out. Chickadees, here in the north in New York, they are only going to nest once a year. Other species like bluebirds and Carolina wrens will also use a nest box. They might keep using the nest, so it would be a good idea to clean the nest after each nest attempt so that they have a fresh start. Otherwise, things like blowflies and mites can kind of build up in there. It might get a little yucky, so it is a pretty good idea to clean it out.
Yeah. I have a question from Susan Jacobson who asks, when the cowbird egg hatches, does it get more food from the parents than their regular legitimate nestlings?
That is often the case. That's a good question because it depends on how big the cowbird is relative to the host species. So, for example, if the cowbird is in a warbler nest, it will typically hatch first and be bigger than the warbler, so it will get a disproportionate amount of food, which can negatively affect the nestlings. In other cases, the cowbird is not as successful. If it happens to be laid, they don't do well in robins' nests. They don't do well in species that are bigger and more competitive. And they don't do well in house finch nests and goldfinch nests because finches are vegetarian and cowbird chicks don't tend to, they don't do well at all in finch nests. So
really
it's not, yeah, it really depends on the species that you're talking about.
Yeah. I have a question from Scott F., who's watching on YouTube. He asks, you mentioned that feathers in nests correlate to improved health of hatchlings. Are there any other things that correlate between nesting materials and improved bird health, nestling health?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that example was specific to tree swallows. In other species, we do see birds might incorporate, some species will incorporate aromatic herbs. And the thought is that those aromatic herbs that have a really pungent smell might have an insecticidal function or might have some kind of insect repellent function. In fact, a number of bird species will incorporate fresh green vegetation into their nest, and they'll do it periodically. They'll even refresh it over time. So they are kind of perhaps impregnating their nest with
like a
this
little Febreze
insecticide.
sprayer, little bird Febreze.
Yeah, just to get those mites out. House wrens do something really, really interesting. They collect spider egg sacs and put them in their nest. And I don't know for sure that it's been proven why they do it. The speculation is that the spider eggs will hatch out of the egg sac and eat the mites or other, bothersome little bugs in the nest. So I don't know that that's for sure been proven, but if you've ever seen a house wren nest, it'll be dotted with little spider egg sacs, which is really cool. So there are a lot of different cool things that birds put in their nest for a very specific reason.
Yeah, I have another question from Susan Jacobson who asks about Nestwatch. If on reporting nest sightings, many times you can see them from far away. You can't count eggs. You can't even maybe see the whole nest. Is that stuff still helpful?
Sure. Yes, definitely. That is still helpful. We know obviously that not every nest is going to be accessible from the ground. So if, for example, you're monitoring an eagle's nest, eventually you would be able to see the chicks, you'll be able to count them. So you might be able to get some kind of count. But even if you don't see the number of eggs, you might be able to determine when incubation started. For example, if the female is sitting really low in the nest, that would be a good clue that incubation has started. And we know that researchers use Nestwatch data for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they just want to know when and where a bird nested, which that data is perfect for that. And other times they might be looking at a climate change question. So all they really need to know is, are birds nesting sooner rather than later? Are they nesting sooner than they did 3 decades ago? Yeah. Which we can answer with Nestwatch data. So you don't necessarily have to have all of the data that we ask for. We'll ask for a lot because we want everything, but obviously we won't know every single question, that you won't be able to fill in every blank for those species. But just in those cases, do your best, and it's definitely still valuable.
Yeah, I'm going to take a couple more questions before we say goodnight. And then Julian Celity asked a question. He noticed on Nestwatch that East Bird Box has a recommended facing direction. Does the direction of the nest, I assume this is mostly for cavity nesting birds, does that help attract certain species?
Yes. So not every single species has a recommended direction. Some of them don't because there's no literature or study to suggest it. But for the ones that do have it, that is just based on studies of their nests in the wild and what they tend to select disproportionate to its availability. So if it says that it's facing south, that doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be more successful or you'll have a much greater chance of attracting them, because you could still get a bird in it if it faces north. But that is reflecting of what the data suggests they would have chosen in the wild. So that is why it will suggest that. In some species, it will just make more sense, like owls don't like morning sun, so we suggest you face them away. So yeah, I mean, take those with a little bit of a grain of salt, but there is some data to suggest it. But if you can't face it a certain way, try a different direction.
Yeah, fascinating. We do have a couple questions that people are asking, what type of nest do certain birds make? Cliff swallow and Mississippi kite. This would be a great time for me to note that Cornell's new project, Birds of the World, is a huge resource for that sort of information, and it is free through Friday. And if you enjoy that, if you decide that you like it, ABA members, if you want to subscribe to Birds of the World, ABA members get a 15% discount to that subscription. So use your ABA membership if you are an ABA member to go ahead and do that. And yeah, I'm gonna do one more question that just came in, and then I'm gonna let you go. Robyn, thank you again so much for doing this tonight. This has been fantastic. A lot of questions, a lot of interest. I love to see it. Thaddeus Wells asks, is it possible for a person's attention to a bird's nest to have a negative impact?
Great question. It is possible that if you spend too much time at a nest, you could have a negative impact. So we want to avoid disturbing a nest to the point where it would be abandoned or attract a predator to potentially notice that nest. So if you go and you join Nestwatch or look at our website, there is a code of conduct that we ask all nest watchers to read. And then we have you take a little quiz, which is very easy, but it's kind of just like the proof that you read the page. To become a certified nest watcher. So we do ask that you do that. That's one of the first things you'll see if you sign up for Nestwatch. Take that quiz, and that'll help you reduce the likelihood of you having an impact on birds. And it's just simple things like don't spend more than a minute at the nest. You don't need to spend any more than that to collect the data. So just be quick. Don't go during a rainstorm, or if it's snowing. It's supposed to snow here on Saturday, so I'm gonna try to not construct my nest on Saturday when it's snowing. There are all kinds of things that we can do to just make it quick and as low disturbance as possible for the birds. And our code of conduct is what you want to look for to help get you certified.
Yeah. So there are a couple more questions coming in. I'm not going to take any more of your time, Robyn. I know you've given so much. We can come back in, and we can try to answer some questions, or at least give you some resources to figure out the answers to some of those questions. But I want to thank you so much, Robyn Bailey from Cornell Lab of Ornithology's Project Nestwatch. Thank you. That's Nestwatch, nestwatch.org. Isn't that correct?
Yes, nestwatch.org.
Yes, nestwatch.org. Go out and watch some nests this spring. It's a great way to enjoy your birding at home. Thank you again, Robyn. I hope you have a great evening.
Yes, thank you, Nate.
All right. Take care. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks for watching.